Hey, everybody, this is Matthew, and I am going to be throwing out of the cycle I had planned on reviewing contracts and addendums, a new addendum. Today is August 28th, 2018, and we have been notified about 2 days ago that the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors, which create the standard forms that we use, has introduced a new well and septic form. Now, generally, that committee only introduces forms in January and July of each year so that we can consolidate all the changes, better prepare for them and train on them and get them in the hands of everybody in a timely manner. This addendum was pushed through. There was a lot of pushback and questions, and the form was just updated last year and then introduced the new concept of only having a default buyer shall pay for septic systems. Everybody kind of wanted to go back to options, which we used very briefly and had a lot of conflicts, but those conflicts seem to be better than the default buyer paying, I guess. I was on the former committee. I'm not on this one, so I'm not going to, I can't explain what the rationale some of these changes are. And I will tell you, this is the one and only addendum where I have some questions about the way it's written and how it's going to apply to us in the field. So I'm going to go through it. Again, some of this language is the same that we've had for quite a while. But for those who are watching and have never used the form, I'm going to go through and explain all these processes and dates for you, and we'll just roll right into it. So this is the private well and septic inspection, and clearly this is only going to be used if the home actually has, well and septic. If they're connected to county, city water, you wouldn't need this form, and you do want to make sure if there are abandoned wells and septic systems that they're taken care of in another way, and there's other training for that. So here we go. The well and the water potability test. This is to make sure that the water is drinkable. So right here in A1, and there is a test required. That test result can be no greater than 90 days old. It needs to be certified by a Virginia licensed laboratory, but it can be collected by either the health department or a insured private company. And so there's a variety of them out there. Some of them actually, termite companies may be certified to do this. Other companies, maybe even your home inspector, they would collect the water in a very particular way. They're checking to make sure there's no chloroform bacteria in it, and it'll be shipped off and then inspected. And again, the inspections can be no greater than 90 days. If there is some type of contaminant in there, the seller at their expense is going to fix it and then retest and deliver back to the buyer the test results that show that the issue is clear, that the water is free of any chloroform bacteria. There are other things that the FHA require, and that'll be in the FHA addendum. So the inspection period, that's for the water test. The water test is no greater than 90 days. The well and well water inspection contingency talks about the actual system itself. So this says that the contract is or isn't contingent until 9 p.m., however many days afterwards. As I've said in every video that we've done, these blanks are there because the transaction is dynamic. There is no standard or default number to put in there, and you shouldn't. This should be based on what's going on in your transaction. If you're doing a 60-day closing, you may want to wait a little longer to do that inspection instead of doing it early and something breaking in between. If you're doing a quick closing in 30 days, you want that done as soon as possible, as to not to, spending as the buyer a lot of money towards other things, only realize the well's failing. And as a seller, you don't want to take it off the market for an extended period of time and the buyers just walk. So that date is dynamics, whatever is unique to your transaction, and use your brain, think it through, find a reasonable date, don't just plug one in there. If you're doing a 45-day closing, I think probably 3 weeks into your transactions, maybe a little too long, but 14, 21 days is probably okay. 2 to 3 weeks would probably be reasonable. The buyer at their expense and at their risk. If the buyer damages the well system while doing an inspection, they're going to have to pay to replace it and bring it whole again. And the buyers are going to by default pay for this well inspection if they wish to have it. And they're going to get a professional and insured inspector to inspect the well. And you need to make sure, if you're recommending someone, that they are properly licensed and insured. As a result of the inspection, the buyer at the end of when they've got the well inspection back, if they're not happy with it, if there's root intrusion or anything that is malfunctioning with the inspection, they need to deliver the entire copy of the report and a written addendum listing the things that need to be fixed, and then ask the seller to fix it. Or, just like the home inspection, here's a copy of that report and we're sending you notice saying we're out. So one of those two options will be there. If the buyer doesn't avail themselves of the protection, if they don't get the inspection done, it just goes away. They can't come back after the date, and then they move forward on this contingency. If they get it done and then deliver the notice to repair but don't finish their negotiations, they may be able to get out as well. So time is an issue here. And again, there can be a number of things wrong with the well, and the buyer has the right, just like home inspection, to say it's just not satisfactory, I'm getting out. Again, going back to my comment on B1 about the date, you, the seller, want to minimize the I can just get out as much as you can. So 2 weeks is often much better as an option, but the buyer's probably going to want a little extra time to maybe do a home inspection first before they encumber the cost of the well inspection, and so they may want 3 weeks or even longer. So again, it's dynamic to what your buyer and seller agree to. So paragraph 2 says, and it's very similar to the home inspection, it says, okay, if you're using B1A, and you're going to give me a copy of the report and an addendum saying, here's the stuff that's broken, fix it, then the parties have until 9 p.m. how many more days? And generally 2 days or 3 days is fine. A seller who's prudent is probably going to want to call a plumber out or some type of repair company to come out and look at it, give them an estimate before they commit to making the repair. Not all things the buyer may find wrong with the well are necessarily disclosable to future buyers, or future buyers would even care about. So the seller needs to make the determination and how damaging is it? Does it rise to the level of I need to disclose because it may not function or be unhealthy? And then if they do decide that they want to fix it, you can go back and forth as to what and how they're going to fix it. And you can go back and forth as often as you want, so long as you're within this date here of the negotiation period. And again, generally 3 days is fine. Maybe 2 days even would be okay. If in 2 days you can't get a plumber out or a repair company and get an estimate and make a decision, you can always extend using an addendum for more days. But don't put 1,000 days out there. Paragraph 3 says there's a buyer election period. So let's go back. We have the first period is the amount of inspection time that we have to get the well inspected and have a company come out. Time number 2 here is the negotiation period that we have to go back and forth and negotiate should there be any problems with the system. And paragraph 3 is the election period. So if paragraph 2 fails, if the option 2 fails, let's say I put 3 days in there that says you and I can negotiate for 3 days, and at the end of 3 days, we haven't had a conclusion. The buyer is not happy with what the seller has put in writing and offered. They won't sign an addendum. You don't have an agreement. This in paragraph 3 is the number of days that the buyer has to say, negotiation's done. I just want to think about this for a bit. And I've seen some really silly stuff, and we talk more about this in the home inspection video, where buyers are literally putting 3 days in there. The buyers are saying, I want to put 3 days, because the buyer agent has no idea what this paragraph is. They've just been told somewhere along the line to put 3 days in. Sellers should not let the buyer have 3 days where the house is off the market and the contract's still alive or not to just randomly dream about whether or not they want to terminate. 1 day should be enough. By the time they've had 2 or 3 weeks to do the inspection and then 3 days to go back and forth or 2 days to go back and forth about it, if there's no agreement made, the buyer should really spend 1 day and go, can I live with this or not? And if I can't, I'm out. That's what that paragraph's for. Paragraph 2 is where it gets a little dicier, and here's where the substantive changes have been in this addendum over the previous addendums we've had. 2A is simple. If you have an alternative septic system and you do have a maintenance contract, does it convey, and the buyer or the seller needs to deliver to the buyer a copy of that maintenance contract for the alternative system within 15 days of ratification. Excuse me. And then they can check here. Now, getting a copy of the contract to the buyer, you need to do in 15 days, but you also need to decide here or check with your company if you have an alternative system to see if the contract or the maintenance contract actually can be given to the next party. Sometimes they have to enter their own maintenance agreement with their own company. That's something you should probably have checked into if you have an alternative septic system when you took the listing. The seller should call their service provider and ask them, is this something that conveys to the next buyer? If not, what's the cost and what's the process to getting it over there? 2B1. Now, we're going to go back to this is where the seller has a functioning septic system at their home. And they're giving to the buyer X number of days after ratification to do a septic inspection. The following, and those number of days, again, is dynamic. It's up to how long you have a contract. If you have a 30-day contract, don't put 21 days down there, because that gives 3 days for you to get, or 3 weeks rather, for you to get inspection company out there, get a report to the buyer. By the time you got the report, if there is a problem, there is no time to address it or fix it, and your closing date's upon you. So really 2 weeks is probably the longest that I would suggest if you're being prudent and reasonable. And if for 2 weeks, for some reason, you can't get a well and septic company to come out, a septic inspector to come out, then ask for more time and negotiate more time. The seller should not sign this agreement until they have talked to and have an understanding about how much it costs and what is done by the septic company for these repairs, and had someone lined up. If you call and they're like, yeah, but we can do it, but we're booked for 4 weeks and you're closing in 4 weeks, you shouldn't sign this contract. You're putting yourself in a position where you can't comply. So after this line about the number of dates, the next line says either the buyer at the buyer's expense and sole risk, or the seller at their seller's expense and sole risk of damage to the property will retain a licensed and insured septic system installer, operator, on-site soil evaluator, professional engineer, or to inspect the private conventional on-site sewage system or private alternative on-site sewage system prior to the inspection. We'll stop there. Okay, so this says buyer is going to do it or seller is going to do it. Seems simple enough. It's at their cost. They have to pay for it. And if there's any damage to the property, they got to bring it back whole to as close to or at what it was prior to dragging it in there. So let me just stop for a second. There's a lot of septic companies who will do this inspection for you. And if it involves exposing the excavation to visually inspect the distribution box, the D box, which is what we'll get to in a minute, they will often promise to do it with hand shovels and hand dig it if it's 2.5 feet or more shallow to get to the box. If it's deeper than that, some of them will want to bring in machinery, including backhoes for whatever reason, to expose the box so that they don't have to hand dig. Some of those companies will also allow the seller to pay more to do the hand digging, even if it's deeper than 2.5 feet. This is a very important thing to remember, is that, and it could be different things for different companies. A lot of the companies I've worked with have said 2 or 3 feet, they'll hand dig. Anything deeper, they're bringing in machines. So if your buyer says, I'll do it, I'll pay for it, or the seller says, I'll sell to you, but only if you pay for it, whatever the reason is, the buyer needs to be made aware that if they bring those trucks in, even if they find something unacceptable to them in the septic system, they're still going to have to pay to repair any grass that's damaged, any landscape that's damaged. I got to take down the wooden fence to get the equipment back there, whatever it is they have to do. The buyer may have to pay to bring all that whole again if they don't like the septic inspection, it seems to be failing or whatever, and the seller says, I'm not going to do it. And of course, the seller has that same liability, but it's their property, so that would be a normal liability. So there is a little bit of risk on either person paying for this. The buyer needs to go in knowing that it could be pretty pricey to bring it all back to whole. And if the seller is paying for it, the seller needs to understand that they're going to be paying for something, and the buyer doesn't want like any one little thing. The buyer could leave out of that contract, and the seller is going to be left there with a $500, $600, $700 inspection that perhaps not all buyers will want to have. So it for both parties, it's a bit of a risk to take responsibility for this. It then goes on to say that it's going to be a Virginia licensed and insured septic system installer. And if you're recommending a company and it's got this kind of language, please make sure you have evidence of the fact that they are licensed and they are insured, or just send it to your seller and go, make sure you check with them before you bring them out to make sure they meet this criteria. And then we get down here to prior to septic inspection, seller will remove any landscaping, personal property, or improvement that impedes the septic inspection. So this is a very broad statement that's now been introduced into this contract. And it says that prior to this inspection, the seller has the obligation to remove landscaping, personal property, and improvements. That could be the fence, that could be the bushes, the flower beds, whatever it is it takes to get a septic company back there. I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to bring up a different version of this copy that I think is going to be how I would handle this as a listing agent. But I think that the seller needs to be made aware that this is going to be very subjective, that the septic company may just direct them to move stuff, and now the contractor can be obligated to do it. They're already obligated to perform a permitted inspection. I'm not quite sure that we absolutely needed a line that says here's all the different things that means that you have to go do, seller, as opposed to saying you need to get an inspection, make sure there's proper people can get back there to do the inspection, and give them some direction. So especially if the buyer's paying for this, we have once again disadvantaged the seller in that the seller has limited control other than what's necessary as defined by whomever to get the equipment back there. Let me go back to what I said. Some companies will hand dig, most will, to a certain depth, and then others will require equipment. If the seller is paying for it, at least they can just direct that company. If the buyer is paying for it, the seller can still add language to this addendum or another addendum that says, okay, but we're only consenting to all of this so long as you, the buyer, agree to hire a company who does the hand-dug version of exposing the box. Hand-dug, by the way, lessens significantly the opportunity to nick the box, damage it, crush it, do whatever. I have heard a couple horror stories. Personally, I haven't seen anything firsthand, and until I see it firsthand, I'm not sure if it really happens that often, but there are stories about machines damaging the distribution box, and so most people prefer hand-dug. Now, remember, we've named a company in this line, and then we've added that these companies, the seller's got to do all these things. If for any reason such impediments are not removed, the septic inspection deadline will be extended for an additional however many days. And again, use your common sense, look at the dynamic nature of your transaction. Maybe 5 days is enough for that, or 3 days if the septic company can come back out. If the parties do not identify a septic inspector above, the party responsible for paying or the expense and sole risk of damage shall select a septic inspector. So, and almost everywhere else in the contract, if you see a blank, something needs to go there. And to be determined, by the way, is never the right option anywhere in any contract, because to be determined means you may not have a meeting of the minds. You're not going to have a distinctive point you can point out and go whether they're in compliance or not. So choose the septic company here, and if the buyer is paying for it, the seller can agree and say, okay, you're paying for it, but I want you to use this company because I know they do good work, or we've gotten estimates, or they've been out here before, or they've maintained our property. And the buyer and seller can decide if they agree to those terms when they move forward. This paragraph says that the parties don't identify the septic system. Again, unlike anywhere else that I can remember in the contract, it's kind of saying, if you do leave it blank, whoever's paying for it can just order it. If that's the case, we probably should have just said whoever's paying for it can order it, unless the seller really has some strong emotion to, it has to be this company, or buyer for that matter. Paragraph 2 says, if the option for the seller to pay and conduct the inspection, they need to understand that the inspection report can't be any sooner than the date of ratification. So you got to stop here and really think this through. If I had a prior contract, let's say that you and I were, that I'm the seller and I had a contract and that buyer just couldn't get their finance in order and they had to bail and terminate their contract, so I put it back in the market. I'm probably going to have another report in hand. I'm going to have one that's good. By default, the language of the contingency says that report can't be any older than the date of ratification. Now also remember, most conventional lenders want a report that's no older than 90 days. VA, FHA, I believe it's 60 days. So the lenders may have some say in how old it can be. None of the lenders are going to necessarily say it has to be after date of ratification. I don't see that being a thing. Sorry about that. So what I would suggest here is, if you think this through, if you're the listing agent and you've put the house back in the market, or if your seller simply had it excavated and inspected just before putting it on the market, just to make sure this gets crossed out and that you don't have to have a new date. Or you can have the inspector come back out and do a whole new inspection, but that's probably going to cost you something. May or may not, but you should check. Here's where it gets a little more complicated. The seller shall deliver the inspection report to the buyer no less than X number of days prior to the septic inspection deadline. All right, so we're going to have an inspection deadline up here. And so let's say that we put in here 3 weeks for our inspection, so 21 days. Down here, it's going to say the buyer, it needs to be the buyer no less than X number of days prior to that 21. So let's say I put 21 days in there. All right, so 21, 20, 19, 18. So 18 days after ratification, I have to deliver to the buyer a report on the septic inspection. So again, I'm the seller. I've agreed to pay for the septic inspection. I'm going to have the septic inspector come out and deliver a report. If I don't have the report in hand and have delivered it under the paragraph marked delivery in the contract, delivered it notably to the buyer 3 days prior to day 21, The buyer has the right then to go order their own septic inspector, and they can choose whatever company they wish, because they're now, unless you've named it up here, okay, they can go choose whatever company they wish, and the seller will be obligated to pay the company that the buyer has chosen, and the seller will also retain the risk for any damages, even though the buyer chose it, because the seller didn't deliver to the buyer with next number of days. I'm using 3 as a random number. You put whatever you want in there prior to the end of the contingency. Couple suggestions. If you're doing a 21-day contingency, do a 21-day delivery. I don't know this whole 3 days, if it's the whole 3-day thing, or I'm using 3 randomly. You can put whatever number, you can be 2 days in there, or 1 day. I would lessen that to be as much as possible to closer and closer to that 21 days. So let's say I do a 1 day, or the 1 day prior to that. Notice in paragraph 2, there is no obligation for the buyer agent to reach out to the listing agent and say, hey, where's my report? You owe me a report. And the listing agent could have said, look, the work's been done. I've already got the report. Don't go order another inspection. But there's no power to do that in this contract. If the seller hasn't met the obligation of delivering a report X number of days prior to the end of the contingency, the buyer has the right to order the inspection, which means that the seller very well may be paying for 2 inspections, and that inspection went from $600 to $1,200 now. And remember that the seller has agreed in B1 that anything that's needed to be removed to get to do the type of inspection that's been ordered will be removed and they're replaced at their own expense and liability. So this paragraph really disadvantages pretty significantly your seller, and it also encourages them to act far more speedily than in previous language or anywhere else in the contract. There's nowhere else in the contract where the buyer can go order something or do something and just make the seller pay for it. This is the one and only place that's been created here. And so you do need to be incredibly careful to watch those dates, put them out as far into the transaction as possible if you're the seller, and then make sure that you do get that report as quickly as possible to the hands of the buyer so that they're not able to order another inspection at your seller's expense and risk. And again, if you're the buyer agent, be a human about this. Communicate with the listing agent and the seller, see if there's any evidence that they ordered it, that it's been done. It's really foolhardy in my opinion and just nefarious if you start ordering inspections without talking to the seller because, whoop, you didn't meet the deadline. Communicate with them, even though the contract permits you to do this. I don't know that it may have been just the only language they could come up with to try to meet this and nothing else really worked. That happens sometimes. But it really does significantly disadvantage your seller if, for whatever reason, they can't control when that report comes in. And the seller should, if they don't have a report in hand a couple of days ahead, ask the buyer to sign an addendum extending this time frame. Don't just keep saying that report's coming, and it may not, because septic companies sometimes just drag their feet and they get it done whenever they get it done. All right. Whew. All right. So septic inspection report within such time frame, the buyer may, prior to the septic inspection deadline, order a septic inspection on behalf of the seller at their expense. It can extend for a number of days here. And again, whatever days you want. Again, 5 days is probably what most people are going to put, maybe even 7. That's really, really long. But it says if I, the seller, haven't delivered to you a copy of that report by date X, however many days prior to the contingency end, then the buyer can go, it triggers the opportunity for the buyer to go order another septic inspection, and it automatically gives them an extra 5, 7, however many days are written in there to get that back. If they choose not to, so option 1 is that the buyer can go order this inspection. If the buyer chooses not to, they can simply void the contract. Dear seller, you haven't performed in the time you gave us. You didn't get that addendum to us or that report to us in a time frame. We hereby terminate. They get their unity back and walk down the road. Level 3 is to simply say, I'm going to pursue all my legal and equitable remedies. Let me just say here, what's missing from here but is insinuated, the buyer and seller can also just sign a simple addendum saying, guys, we need more time. Let's sign an addendum extending the contingency period for another week. We've done everything we could. Except the companies were backed up, or they did the inspection and they're trying to get a report together and they said it's okay, whatever it is. Use some common sense here. That's the invisible option 4 I'm going to add here, is that the buyer and seller can simply agree and extend the contingency. Paragraph 3, when you read it, my assumption is, and I did talk to a couple people about this, but the assumption is that the seller didn't perform. They didn't in good faith do what they promised to do in the contract by getting this report done, and they could be in default. That's why your buyer, before they terminate, if they want to show damages, because they might be able to, need to talk to an attorney. Number three, all the inspections that are done, if any inspections to be done at all, includes a visual walkover and probing the drain field to make sure there's no saturation if it's a conventional field. That's normal. We used to have 4 checkboxes here. We just said, look, if you're doing any inspection, you're going to go out and probe the lines in the field. We just added that in there, so there's no more checkbox for it. In addition to that is the pumping and inspection. Now, anyone who's worked with well and septic before knows that almost every company who's going to do a septic inspection is going to require that the tank be cleaned out to do a proper inspection and a full inspection. So if you are doing an inspection at all, you're more likely going to have to pump the tanks. And then, this is what we discussed earlier, excavation of as necessary to visually inspect all distribution boxes if present, test pumps, controls, evaluate the function of all this stuff. So this is giving them consent to actually expose and dig up the box. Now, you can have this inspection where they merely come out, walk across the field and go, there's no leakage in the field, it doesn't seem like anything is saturated, it seems all healthy and good. It's a very limited inspection. It's not usually that great of an inspection. If they want a full-on inspection, which is where you actually see the money being spent, and the risk here is when they start digging up boxes and excavating things. Paragraph 4 says the septic inspection report indicates it indicates that there's repairs necessary or that the system needs to be replaced. The buyer then has, just like home inspection, option A is, here's a copy of the report outlining the problems with it and a list of what I want you to do to address it, and let's now talk about it. Or B, here's a copy of the report and we're out. Here's my notice, I'm terminating the contract. I don't want to deal with any of these issues. Okay, and if you don't take any action, if you don't do the things by this inspection period contingency here, then the buyer simply loses all of these rights and they move forward to closing. If there is a problem and they choose 4A and they give you a copy of the report and they give you the list of their problems to solve, then paragraph B kicks in and you get X number of days, and generally 2 or 3 days is good enough to start the conversation, because most of the time when a septic company says here's a problem, they're going to tell you what you need to do to remedy it, and they may even give you an estimate of it. So the seller should have that information. Again, look at all these dates here. You could be 4 weeks into a 30-day closing before you've even gotten to this point. So tighten those dates up. Shorter is better. Use some common sense. And at any time that the buyer doesn't like what's going on, they can simply terminate and say, I'm done, right? I'm terminating the contract. I don't like how negotiations is going. I've done everything by timeline. I don't like the repairs, and we're done. Paragraph 6 goes back to what I said earlier under paragraph 1.3. It says you get 2 days to negotiate. If the end of 2 days there's no agreement, the buyer gets X number of days. I suggest 1 day to say, I'm tired of this. We're done negotiating. All these contingencies are done. We're just not moving forward. It's a rest day for them to get their mind wrapped around the problem. So that's the new well and septic addendum and some of the issues. And I'm just going to share this little extra tidbit. As a listing agent, I have some concerns about this addendum. And so what I would suggest, a couple things, and not every single one of these, but a couple of things if you're the listing agent, you may want to try to counter on. Again, the buyer may look at it and say, I'm not giving up any of my rights, and then the seller makes a decision whether they're willing to sell under these conditions. Number one, I think that your seller should be careful about this area. It says the seller will remove any landscaping personal property. The contract already requires the property to be available to the inspectors to come out. So I think you're okay to just say that that's a global enough statement. The seller shouldn't have to also delineate here what they're expected to do to make that happen. And again, if those things are not removed, this contract automatically extends. Now, buyer agents, I'm telling you, buyer agents use this form the way it's written. It's great for your buyers. Listing agents, these are some things you may want to counter on and just make sure you're having conversations with the seller. Number two, if you've already had a recent inspection, scratch through this line and go, that inspection will be no more than 10, 15 days prior to ratification, whatever it is that you have one in hand. And then number three, this whole section, in the event a seller does not deliver, you can still have a very good addendum for the buyer and seller if you simply strike this ability for the buyer to order an inspection. If the seller doesn't perform, the seller didn't get it done in a contingency period, the seller didn't act in good faith, and the buyer should seek an attorney's advice about what to do next. Now, this is what mine may look like as a listing agent if I have issues with these or my seller has issues with these. But do remember the buyer is going to freak out and go, you're crossing out half of my protections. And even the buyer didn't know what those protections were in the beginning. Now they see standard forms being crossed out. So those would be the three areas that I think you should take some pause in as a listing agent to make sure that your client knows what they're getting into before they execute and agree to those terms. So as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to help you out the best I can. Get with your brokers if you need more explanation or better definition of what this looks like. Every transaction is different. So that area I showed you of some of the things I imagine most sellers will probably want to counter at, your seller may not care, and other sellers who are more prudent may want to nitpick that, make sure they're not over obligating themselves to anything. So that's it. That's my review of the well and septic tank system addendum. Remember that does get pushed out to zip forms on September 15th, I believe is the date we were given. So it's just a couple weeks out for those who are watching the video now. For those who are just taking it in review, of course, we'll take this video down, put another one up when another variation of the addendum comes up. Well and septic has always been a problem in the contract to handle. It's a very difficult and very expensive issue. So they're constantly trying to fine tune it. And this is an attempt to do the best they can to meet everybody's objections and questions and what ifs and things. I just think there's a lot of risk for your seller here and a lot of power being given to the buyer that we don't necessarily see elsewhere in the contract. So use some good common sense when you're working through this. Don't use default numbers of just what randomly goes in there. Think it through. Make sure you're protecting your buyer and your seller. And again, if you have any questions, reach out to your brokers. They'll be happy to help. Thanks.